Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a great day so far. And we are going to dive right back in here into the book of Philippians. And we're going to get into what is one of my favorite verses. And I think sometimes it's overlooked here in the book of Philippians because of how popular, how well known Philippians chapter number 4 is. And even along with Philippians chapter number 3. And even to be honest with you, some of Philippians chapter number 2, especially verses 8 through or verses 6 through 11, there in Philippians chapter number 2. But we're going to dive back into Philippians chapter number 1. And we ended last video with verse number 11. And we're going to look at verse number 12. And we might make it down to verse number 14. I'm not going to try to keep you too long. But I really love verse number 12. Now, again, let us remember the setting of the book of Philippians and the overall theme of the book of Philippians in joy, and how Paul has joy even though he is in prison. And we're going to look at that a little bit here in these couple verses. But look with me, if you got your Bible, let's look at verse number 12. And verse number 12 says, "But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel." Now, like I said, that verse right there is one of my favorite verses, not just in the book of Philippians, but really throughout the entire Bible, because there's so much, there's truth in it, obviously, but there's so much, I guess if you want to call it a promise, or if you want to say, kind of a understanding as to why some of the things that we face happen. But as you look at verse number 12, I want us to understand something about the Apostle Paul. And I want to make sure that I say what I have written down. I want to make sure I say it right. It is this. The Apostle Paul had one purpose in his life or in his ministry. Now, we could even say almost the same thing before the Apostle Paul got saved when he was still Saul. Back between Acts chapter number 6 and Acts chapter number 8 into Acts chapter number 9, is that Paul had the desire to find people in this way, is what it says in Acts chapter number 9, or the people that worshiped Christ, the people who believed Christ was who Christ said he was. The church, he went and he would imprison them, bring them back. And you could say that that was Paul's purpose at that time. But now, after Paul gets saved, Paul has one purpose. And that one purpose is spreading the gospel. That was Paul's purpose, was spreading the gospel, especially when you look at the book of 1 Corinthians in chapter number 1. He talks about the preaching of Christ. So we look at this verse in verse number 12, and he says it in a way that I say a lot while I'm preaching about understand this. But this is what he says, "But I would ye should understand that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel." Now, understand some of the things that happened to the Apostle Paul. You can find it, and he goes through a whole list of things that he's done: the imprisonments, the beatings, the shipwrecks, just the persecution that Paul had. And understand something in this life, and Paul tells us, he says, all those who desire to live godly, they're going to suffer persecution. And I know I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but if you're going to live godly, you are going to suffer some persecution. And Paul is saying here, he says, "But I want you to understand that all of this that has happened to me," and especially when you look at the book of Philippians and him being in a jail cell at this time, or in prison at this time, that he is able to say this very thing, that all these things that have happened to me, God is going to use this for the furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Paul knows something with God, and it is this, is that God, if he holds all these things in his hand, like we believe that he does, and all the time, all the matter, just everything, he holds it all into his hands. I heard one preacher say it like this, is he said that if God has spoken everything to existence, and you look at the way that our world is and the way that it tilts on its axis, is that if it tilted 1 degree closer to the sun, that we would all burn up to death. But if it tilted 1 degree away from the sun, we would all freeze to death. But God knew all this when he orchestrated it and put it into a perfect place. And Paul is saying that all these times, all this matter, if that is in God's hands, then I understand that nothing is going to happen by chance in my life, that God is going to use whatever it is in my life, and He's going to use it to the furtherance of the gospel. And this is shown back in John chapter number 9. And you look at John chapter number 9, and you find this story, and I believe this is a perfect example of what Paul is talking about here. John chapter number 9 says in verse number 1, "And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master," look at what they asked him, "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And listen to Jesus' answer here. Verse number 3 says, "Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." Ain't that interesting? I find it very interesting, but also very encouraging that Jesus is looking here as his disciples are asking him, whose fault is it that this man was born blind? Whose sins caused this man to be born blind? And Jesus said, it wasn't anybody's sin. It wasn't his parents. It wasn't his. But what happened is that God had orchestrated it in this way that he would be born blind. That was God's will, that he would be born blind. Why? So that the works of God should be made manifest in him. So as you look at the Apostle Paul, as he is sitting here in a jail cell, and he's sitting there with the guards around him, and we would all say to the Apostle Paul, you have a reason to be upset over what is going on. But Paul says, no, not going to be upset about it, because everything that is happening to me right now is for the furtherance of the gospel. We read what Paul says to the Romans in Romans chapter number 8 and verse number 28, one of the most familiar scriptures in the entire Bible, where he says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them which are called according to his purpose." All things work together for good. And you think about back in the law, or back before the Exodus takes place in the law, that you find that everything that they did to the children of Israel, all the slavery, everything that they did, if you remember what happened is the people of Israel, God's people, they grew stronger and stronger and stronger. And understand that people might try to do some crazy stuff to us as Christians, but we know what Jesus tells Peter, and how he says it to Peter, is that the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. That understands something, that they might try to do some stuff to us as Christians, but with God on our side, as Romans 8:31 says, "For if God be for us, who can be against us?" So understand that whatever it is that's happening to you, and it's real easy if we're not careful to let let's just say a disease that has come in that we've begged God to take away, but yet God doesn't take it away. It's real easy if we're not careful to get discouraged and to doubt and get depressed about these things. But understand, God might be allowing you to go through whatever that might be to further the gospel. I think about really the hardest thing that I've been through in my life was our first miscarriage. Now, my wife and I have suffered several, or she has, well, it was suffering to me as well, several miscarriages throughout our marriage. But the first one was one that really, at that time, it really just, I don't know, it almost took me out, to say the least. It made me to a point where even as I was pastoring, I was trying to pour out of an empty cup. And it sounds just like what it is. There wasn't anything for me to pour out. I was so upset and angry at God. But then I realized that God can use what I went through to the furtherance of his gospel. And I've been able to minister now to some people who had the same experience that we did, but show them how God can take that experience and use it. Almost like what Joseph talks about with his brothers, where he says, "What you meant unto me for evil, but God meant it unto me for good." And there's a lot of times that as we look through our life that we see some things that we wonder what's the point of this? But Paul gives us the point of it, that everything that happens to us, God can use for the furtherance of his gospel if we will allow God to do it. I said I wasn't going to take much time, and I was planning on getting into verse number 13. But I pray that whatever it is that you're going through, I mean, it can be a family trouble, it can be a marital problem, it can be a child problem, somebody has gone astray, it can be a friend problem, it can be a work problem, it might even be a physical problem. You've got a disease or something to that effect, or it could even be a mental problem. I mean, this world, if we're not careful, can get to our mind, and it can make us discouraged, and it can make us doubt, and it can make us depressed. But you just keep looking to God, putting your faith in God, and do what Hebrews 11:6 says, where it says, but without faith it is impossible to please God. God is a rewarder to those, and I know I'm kind of butchering it a little bit. I want to read it to you because I believe this is the help that we need in putting our faith in God. But Hebrews 11:6, where it says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And I promise you, whatever it is that you're going through, you diligently seek God, God is going to help you. God is. But how's your faith? How's your faith? Paul had the faith that everything that happened to him was to the furtherance of the gospel. And whatever it is that you're going through, understand God will never leave thee. He will never forsake thee, and he will help you get through whatever it is that you're going through. And he will do it in a way that furthers the gospel. You just got to let him use you. So I hope you had or this was a help to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And we'll try to post again tomorrow and hopefully get through more than just one verse. But my name is Pastor Alan Jones. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.